Many years ago, when I was in high school, I had a project to interview a real working scientist. Fortunately, my dad worked at our local university and knew a scientist working in a radiation lab. So I set out to interview him. The lab itself was very hard to find. It was in the basement of a building, down in behind the janitorial area. Very dark, creepy, and isolated. Finally, I find it. The scientist, an elderly man, this was in the early 1980s, was very willing to talk. In fact, he seemed quite lonely. After working through all my interview questions, he got to talking about his life generally, and gradually it turned to his experiences as a young sailor on board an escort vessel in the North Atlantic during the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II. What I didn't know was that the fellow was about to expose some deep trauma that had been with him his whole life since then. As he talked, he got more emotional about the stress he was under, the endless storms, the ever-present threat of torpedoes, the lonely watches staring at nothing. Finally, he reached the climax of his story. According to him, on one of those endless night watches, he was visited by a friend of his on the crew who wasn't scheduled to be there, who had some sort of bone to pick with him. The two got arguing about this, and it ended with punches thrown. The friend hit his head on a bulkhead and went down, unconscious or dead. The narrator, in fear of punishment, pushed the guy's body overboard. It was night in the North Atlantic in winter, with a high sea, and no one saw him do it. The friend was just listed as missing, presumed overboard accidentally. But of course he'd been murdered. I had no idea how to react to that. I quickly made my excuses and left. I was traveling the country and sleeping in the back of my truck or in a teepee-style tent I had bought off of Amazon. This particular night I had set up my tent in a desolate camping area about 15 to 20 miles from the highway. There was only one other rig in the campsites and they were pretty far away, so it was nice, quiet, and peaceful. I dozed off for the night and awoke to some odd sounds on my tent. It sounded like someone was dragging their fingers up and down the nylon walking around the tent. I sat completely still and just listened to the whirring of something dragging on the nylon without making a move. About 10 minutes or so go by, felt like an eternity, and the sound stopped. I laid in my cot and listened for another 15 minutes or so, when all of a sudden my tent capsizes and falls down over myself and my cot. A small center support had angled the tent at 45-degree angle, so I could still access the opening. I ripped the zipper open and ran from my truck, crawled into the back, locked the topper from the inside, and grabbed my firearm. I laid awake for the rest of the night until the sunrise so I could go retrieve my tent cook stove cot from the campsite. I arrived at the campsite to inspect the area to see if I was just on the road too long and paranoid, or an intruder or guest had come to visit in the wee hours of the night. Around my tent in the desert dirt snow were shoe prints making a steady circle around the tent. Different size foot than mine and what looked to be like a pointed cowboy boot, and they had circled several times and then wandered off into the valley. I've never been back since and still get the heebie-jeebies every time I go tent camping now. Anyone else have a crazy experience while out in the backwoods desert? When I was a kid, my dad managed a restaurant downtown. He would pick me up after school, and I'd go with him to work and wait for my mom to pick me up after she got off of work. This restaurant was in a very old building and had 4 large floors. I'd run around all the levels and through the kitchen, but I always got a creepy feeling on the 3rd floor. This floor had mirrors everywhere and a bunch of pool tables. Since the restaurant would be closed when I was there, the lights were always turned off. I remember one day I was doing my daily patrol sprint around the pool tables and the air got super cold out of nowhere. I never experienced a cold like that inside. It was bizarre. But I stopped and looked around the room, and in the far corner, I shit you not, I saw a woman who was glowing white in an old Victorian era, dressed just straight up, walk through one of the tables. I ran so incredibly fast that I fell down the stairs and still have a scar from absolutely obliterating my shin on the base of the railing. I asked my dad about the restaurant recently, and he told me about having to do paperwork in his office, which was on that third floor, and he would see a woman in a Victorian dress walking around.